kiss me like a prince. And power.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the second episode of Eulogy, a show where I take an in-depth look at various media within the horror genre, that is everything from movies to video games to really anything else that I may find worthy of discussion, and I'll critique as much of the content as I can. My name is Adrian, and I'm a horror enthusiast with many projects venturing into said genre, and today I'd like to discuss yet another movie that I thoroughly enjoy. So sit tight or just put me on in the background, because this is going to be a long one. Let's talk about Beyond the Black Rainbow. Beyond the Black Rainbow is a 2010 sci-fi horror film written and directed by Panos Cosmatos, son of director George P. Cosmatos, the guy who did Tombstone.
Why, Johnny Ringo, you look like somebody just walked over your grave.
The idea came about when Cosmatos wanted to recreate childhood experiences of trying to imagine what horror movies were about based purely on their cover art. Actually, kinda like how Hidetaka Miyazaki tells stories in the Soulsborne series. Cosmatos used this foundation to conceive two possible ideas for his debut film. One would be a young girl trapped in a mental institution, while the other would be a sort of mock advertisement for a fictional institution. It was then, after much planning and consideration, that he had the revelation.
¿Por qué no los dos?
Thus, the concept was finalized. The best part of this development was Cosmatos took a ton of inspiration from the 70s and 80s, and thus the retro style was adopted. This movie is oftentimes the definitive example that I cite for the genre of retro horror. That is, movies filmed to look like the style of earlier times or set in the times they take place, and aesthetically attempt to match or modernize some of those aspects. Either way, Beyond the Black Rainbow was doing it way before bullshit like It Follows and Stranger Things came along. Yeah, I'm coming for you, Stranger Things. The whole thing is 110 minutes long and easily accessible around the internet or through your normal streaming services. Though don't count on Netflix like I always do. See, I always see Gangs of New York and think, you know what, I'm gonna watch that again. It's been like forever. Only to have it be gone the next goddamn day.
What did you say?
Anyway, without further ado, let's talk about this movie. The film opens with a 70s-style informational video for the Arborea Institute, a New Age research facility which has supposedly discovered the secret to creating happiness through a blend of spiritualism, psychology, and science. We're then shown our good character, Elena, played by Ava Bourne, a glowing pyramid-like object which plays a central role in this facility, and the clearly sinister Barry Nile, played by Michael Rogers, who looks like a creepy Carl Sagan, and I fucking love it. We're introduced to their relationship, that is therapist/doctor, and patient, but clearly there is more going on, as evidenced by Barry's antagonistic behavior. Elena is then escorted back to her room by Margot, the facility's nurse, and it's revealed that Elena has some form of psychic power based on a nosebleed the nurse experiences and the reaction she displays towards Elena. Barry returns home, and his relationship with his wife, sister, or mom, we don't actually know. Anyway, her name is Rosemary, and their relationship is shown, and it's not good. He catches her asleep, and there's an awkward, tension-filled exchange between the two before Barry heads off to bed.
I wasn't sleeping. I was meditating.
Oh, you're meditating, yeah.
But not before taking copious amounts of prescription medication and smiling creepily at his reflection. Seriously, look at this, there are like 10 pills here. We're then shown Elena back in her room, and she uses her psychic abilities to receive television channels on a computer screen in the wall. She flips through a few channels until coming across a cartoon which briefly elicits a sort of smile, but immediately fades as the show depicts a situation similar to her own. The scene ends abruptly, and we're back in a therapy session with Barry telling Elena about her mother, whom she has never met, suggesting that if she looks around her room, she may find a photograph of her in there. All the while, Barry gets even more obsessive looking towards Elena. Back in Elena's room, she remembers what Barry said and she checks underneath her bed. Sure enough, she finds the photograph, which we're hardly shown as the audience, and a nice little moment happens, only to be immediately interrupted by Barry staring from a monitor room. Later that evening, or day, I don't know, time is hard to follow in this place, Elena is able to hear a heartbeat coming from deep within the facility, and she tries to narrow down where using her abilities. She is halted suddenly by the glowing prism we were shown in the beginning, which now shows us it projects a force field that suppresses Elena's powers. The next day, during a routine therapy session, Elena finally communicates back with Barry telepathically, demanding that she is able to meet her father, whom she believes the heartbeat was coming from. Barry says that this isn't possible, as the world outside is dangerous and she isn't well enough to function on her own. We then cut to Nurse Margot, who is seemingly on her way out of the facility for the night when she is stopped by a malfunctioning storage space in a room nearby. Upon investigation, she finds a notebook with all of Barry's files on the sessions with Elena. Surreal and downright unsettling imagery is shown throughout, and even Margot gives us the what the fuck and is too creeped out to continue. She quickly leaves but drops some of her cigarette's ashes nearby. Back at Barry's house, we hear a phone ringing and find Barry sitting down admiring some quartz crystals while he calls out to Rosemary to pick it up. After a few moments, he does it himself, and we get a strange scene of him talking to seemingly nothing but random static and modem connecting noises, like in the dial-up internet days. He is clearly disturbed by this, and it's revealed the phone isn't even plugged in. He rushes back to the facility and finds the ashes from Margot's cigarette near his secret files. He disposes of the ashes and is clearly agitated, so he pops some more of his medication or some type of drug because the walls start bleeding. We then cut to Margot working at her computer when Barry approaches her from behind and warns her that Elena may be hiding an illicit object, the photo, in her quarters. The scene is tense as all hell.
I don't know, Margot. I don't know. But I'm looking into it.
Margot then delivers Elena's food, finds the photo, and promptly crushes it. Oh, while taunting Elena about her mother's death, too. All the while, Barry was watching via the security cameras and turns down the field emitted by the pyramid, allowing Elena to psychically kill Margot in a pretty brutal-looking fashion. Barry seems creepily pleased with this and watches as Elena tries to slip out the now-open door. He turns the pyramid's field back up to put an end to that noise, so the most aesthetic as fuck scene can begin. A fog-like sedative fills the halls and knocks Elena unconscious, and Barry activates the Sentionaut, a robotic-like entity who proceeds to inject a tracking device into Elena's neck, cleans up the body of the nurse, and returns Elena back to her room. Barry stares creepily through the door. Barry then heads down deeper into the facility to visit Mercurio Arborea, the founder of the Institute, who we saw in the film's intro, only now in a strung-out, sickly state. His room is filled with decay and neglect, and he rambles a bit before asking Barry to assist him in injecting more of his routine drug of choice. Barry agrees, but not before getting a flashback to 1966, where he was given a powerful hallucinogenic drug and sent off on a nightmarish trip, which ultimately broke him. We're given a lengthy scene of this flashback sequence with Barry sinking into an abyss, some black substance, seeing crazy shit, and upon returning to the real world he bites the throat out of Dr. Arborea's wife who was present. Then we're shown a baby being held, Elena, that is now going to be submerged into the same black substance that Barry just came out of. Why? Barry then injects Dr. Arborea with an overdose and returns home. He then undergoes a strange transformation by removing his hair, which was prosthetic, and his eyes, which were permanent contacts. He dresses all up in a leather outfit and collects his custom knife, Devil's Teardrop, and confronts Rosemary. He expresses his inner turmoil to her, and then he kills her. We're then back at the facility, with Elena being able to now slowly but surely escape her quarters. She moves from floor to floor and is pursued by the wandering Sentionaut before escaping into another patient's room, who is revealed to be a straitjacket-bound, mutant-like creature which also pursues her. She just manages to get out of the room before running into the Sentionaut, but now that she's free of the pyramid's influence, she is able to hold it in place with her powers and escapes around it, but not before revealing its face to her. She finds herself in a quaint, more contemporary room, which then leads into a beautiful garden scene to her finally making it to the outside of the facility. Meanwhile, Barry arrives at Elena's room and drags his knife along his crotch while sniffing her bed sheets. I am not making this up. He gets in the car and follows the tracker to her position, but not before having an awesome moment of self-actualization. Elena falls asleep in a field. We then witness two guys sitting around a fire, a la the horror movie standard, and both are quickly offed by Barry. Hey, it's the guy from Cigarette Burns! Oh, never mind. Elena then awakens and is confronted by Barry, who was watching her sleep, because of course he was. He tries to approach her, telling her to come to him, but she sticks his feet to the ground with her powers. Barry then falls and cracks his head on a rock, killing him instantly. Elena wanders further off into the night and encounters a sleepy neighborhood with one home's television being on. The movie ends. So now let's talk about the technical aspects of this movie. The first description that comes to mind for me is that this is a very static film, as in action and dynamic camera movement kind of take a backseat to the visual aesthetics. This doesn't mean that they aren't present, as I'll discuss some in a moment, but I'm speaking broadly here, and it's not necessarily a bad thing because this movie is so visually striking. This can translate as boring to some people, and it doesn't help that this movie is primarily back and forth conversations, and those conversations are almost always one-sided, so there's that. Having said that though, this movie is aesthetic as fuck. Hats off to the cinematographer Norm Lee with the amazing uses of lighting, color, and camera work. A lot of great dynamic shots when they do occur, up close and personal shots which make the viewer almost intrusively close to the characters, and a great use of different angles and jarring effects to emphasize much of the tone of what is going on screen. There's a ton of craftsmanship that went into making this film look like an authentic piece from the time, that is 1983, while still blending an air of neo-futurism to it. Transitions can be quite interesting, tons of slow blends into the next scene, leaving some residual imagery behind to almost blur linear time or symbolically show us some form of connectedness occurring. I want to use the term bleed here because I feel it's actually pretty appropriate with much of the red flashes and tones. Most of these are pretty well executed, while a few seem a bit off or kind of awkward, as if the imagery didn't want to easily transition that way. Other transitions can be downright seizure-inducing, with pulsating lights and rapid flashing imagery, but nothing too outside the realm of normality within the horror genre. Lots of great scene composition, with many shots doing wonders to balance each other out visually and symbolically. An example here would be with Barry talking to Rosemary in the beginning. Note how she's on the right side of the screen whilst reflected in the window. Barry is on the left side to balance this out, while adding an interesting layer of depth to the shot-reverse shot conversation. Rosemary's reflection is seen in the window, which could represent the inner self of the individual, less revealed to the world, which Barry can clearly see. Meanwhile, Barry is positioned next to a dark doorway, literally just shadow, conveying his dark, mysterious nature, and that we cannot read him as easily as we might think. Tons of close-ups on items and the characters' interactions with them, allowing the scene to move forward in an interesting way, visually conveying some important ideas, and letting the sound design really help deliver the tone. Lighting is exceptional, with scenes almost being color-coded to represent different ideas, emotions, and events. Barry is red, Elena is blue or white, and Arborea is a sickly pale green. This doesn't always act well in the movie's favor, though, as sometimes the scenes can look entirely washed out or simply low resolution, but I suppose you could make the argument for time period authenticity with that. Another issue that arises is the clash of complementary colors like red and blue that can create some visual strain, as both colors end up competing for the eye's attention, but the movie does well to use this to its advantage, as the whole thing is kinda uncomfortable. But all in all, the lighting is expertly used to emphasize the facial movements and emotive displays of Barry, create an interesting spotlight effect on the characters in general, and overall create a sterile, futuristic atmosphere for the facility. The soundtrack is legit as hell. Dark ambient with retro-infused synthesizers make you want to tap your foot just as much as you want to hide from the approaching horror. Harkens back to the age of the classic horror movies of the late 70s, early 80s, but with a solid modern edge. Jeremy Schmidt, the guy who did the soundtrack, used many authentic synthesizers to create the score, and it really delivers. Sound design is excellent, with every little detail of the environment blending in orally. The whole movie is a perfect example of dark ambiance. When there isn't an ominous synthesizer track permeating the scene, the background noises such as computers in the facility or the pyramid itself resonating is enough to always keep us on edge. But then, just as you think it's going to be predictable, there are moments of straight-up silence from the soundtrack, and only the noise of the environment, which, in and of itself, can be the most disturbing. A great example of mixing these concepts is the phone call scene, where after a disturbing conversation, which sounds literally like noise to us, Barry hangs up the phone and is momentarily in silence, with the diegetic sound of crickets and nature in the background. We then are suddenly met with a quick little dissonant tone of what sounds like violin strings, reminiscent of a stinger, but way too short and way too quiet. What makes this scene even more unsettling is the fact that we, the audience, along with Barry, notice it. For those who don't know, diegetic sound basically means it's coming from within the film, so the characters can hear it and the world can be influenced by it. Non-diegetic is sound that's outside the film, so something like the background music, which no one in the film obviously hears. Here's an example of a good use of blending them together.
Texture like sun lays me down.
Another great example of sound in this movie is during the scenes with Barry first arriving home. The background ambiance is filled with these strange, harrowing moans or howls, which do such a great job at creating uneasiness, and if you really aren't paying attention, you won't quite pick up on them. Sound effects themselves are well done, with again, no noticeable stock noises popping out, and everything seems to blend well enough with the film's narrative. I like the pen sound here, though. Oh, it sounds good. Acting in this movie is pretty damn good, and most notably, Michael Rogers' performance as the unhinged Barry Nile has left me wondering why I haven't seen this guy in more movies. His utter disdain and contempt for everyone around him is beautifully displayed in his facial contortions and subtle body language of passive aggressiveness. I cannot gush enough about how much I love how his creepiness is so delicately balanced with a presentable appearance, an appearance that is a cracking facade as the movie progresses. It's like, how do you go from a total creep to even more of a total creep? And it's just wonderful. Elena, despite only speaking once and being very subdued, is a solid performance that encapsulates what I feel to be the true overbearing weight of depression. This is exemplified by her constantly being slow and lethargic and always on the verge of tears. If you don't know this feeling, consider yourself lucky, but not being able to relate to depression doesn't take away from her emotional performance of being trapped in a hopeless situation. And of course, Dr. Arborea kicks things off in the beginning with an awesomely designed intro to welcome you in, but also remains slightly uncanny in all red lighting and with an odd, wide-eyed stare. Clearly something is off with the guy, but we don't entirely know for certain what it is, all conveyed by a simple monologue in the beginning. His later decrepit appearance also is worthy of mention because this guy is clearly fucked up both mentally and physically. The visual aesthetics of this movie are amazing. Retro style done fucking awesomely. Barry is terrifying as a creepy Carl Sagan into the murderous monster he becomes, with messed up eyes and clad in leather. The facility itself is reminiscent of the dystopian futuristic styles of literary lore. The Sentionauts are like Stanley Kubrick and Daft Punk had a love child, and it's a combination I didn't know could exist, but now I desperately want more of. Not to mention, it's such a good reveal of its face and stature. Makeup effects and creature design are spot on in that regard. The mutant patient thing we encounter later on is pretty unnerving in its appearance and behavior. There is gore, albeit not a focal point of the film, though if you like the slasher films, this movie does more than just give them a nod. It blatantly becomes one for a little bit towards the end. We get to see two chodes stabbed to death by a campfire, both right through the mouths. Also, Margot's death was sufficiently bloody and done pretty well at obscuring some details while still goring it up. Okay, so I could go on way longer discussing the technical aspects, but let's go ahead and get to the good stuff. We specifically delve now into the themes, concepts, and story details and see how its strengths and weaknesses fare in terms of horror as a genre. Is it good? Is it bad? Well, let's find out. Where to even begin with this movie? There's so much going on that it makes trying to pin down a good starting point damn near impossible. So let's start with the most obvious and overt images and themes, and we'll go from there into the more esoteric. One of the first major ideas presented, or more appropriately, the entire plot, centers around a girl trapped in some type of medical facility. This is established through the various therapy sessions and medical references, so it's implied that this is indeed a hospital of some variety, but is more akin to us, the audience, of a dystopian prison of sorts. This creates a feeling of helplessness and frustration as we witness a girl who, from our initial standpoint, doesn't seem to have anything wrong with her and is held against her will in this place. This brings us to an interesting feeling similar to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which is the idea of being the only sane person trapped in an insane situation, only to find that the patients and the committed are not necessarily at fault for this, but rather the overbearing and draconian institution which imprisons them.
You sit down, Mr. Cheswick, and wait your turn. Go ahead, sit down.
Trapped against your will in an asylum-like setting is a unique but not too uncommon a fear, and this movie does a great job at being a new addition to this area. Not to mention, being drugged up to the point where you're incapable of acting anyway adds a whole new level of tension to the scenario. It says there is no fighting the system, and the system will win should push come to shove, but don't worry, it's for your own good. Yeah, definitely a good theme of horror. Which brings us to other areas of psychology this movie slightly touches upon, such as the idea of gaslighting and psychic driving. Gaslighting is manipulating an individual into questioning their own sanity, and this is evidenced by Barry's constant insisting of Elena's illness.
You're a very sick girl, Elena. You're not well.
Not to mention that through the notes we get a brief glimpse of in the beginning, it says, induce emotional state, followed by his antagonistic behavior. The other concept, psychic driving, is a really creepy technique that was developed during the 1950s in order to influence the behavior of a subject. Basically, you'd play a message on repeat constantly to try and embed the message into the recipient's mind. Eventually, add in some crazy mind-altering drugs and some electroshock therapy, and you've got yourself a potential method for deconstructing an individual's personality and ideally resculpting them from the ground up. I am not making this up. This technique was used during the CIA's MK Ultra days, a series of horrifying experiments that are well beyond the scope of this video. Look it up. Anyway, the movie immediately kicks off with the idea that Elena is heavily drugged or just sedated in general, with the opening credits even being shown over a dilating pupil, but we'll add more to that later. Also, quick note that this is not the first example in horror of the creepy therapist controlling and manipulating all those around him.
You intend me to be my own Last Supper?
Yes.
How does one politely refuse a dish in circumstances such as these?
One doesn't.
On the topic of trapped in a crazy situation, we have the next overt theme that is Barry himself in the role of the gatekeeper to the outside world, the authoritarian despot to this world, and if we're going by true horror motifs, he's the mad scientist, if you will. His character is highly multifaceted, and we'll spend a bit more time looking into him later on, but for now we'll focus on the surface elements listed. First, we know the only thing standing between the outside world and Elena is Barry himself. He is her obsessor, keeping her contained like a prized pet of sorts. Since he cannot physically stop or restrain her due to her psychic abilities, he can only keep her under lock and key and within the confines of a world he controls, abusing and toying with her as he sees fit, hence the authoritarianism. The sadomasochism themes are something we'll get into a bit more later as well, because they're there. Finally, when I meant mad scientist, it's pretty self-explanatory in that he has this whole facility under his control, and through the sentient and the deformed patient, we're shown that he's been performing some pretty fucked up experiments on what we can only assume are the other patients or inmates, whatever you want to call them. These concepts all put together make for some great horror. Not to mention, so many questions are raised by Barry's notebook itself with all the information and pictures briefly shown, beginning with a strict medical appearance, then quickly delving into what appears to be the alchemical, a blending of science and the occult. A blending of science and the occult. Has anything like that ever been done in horror? I mean, in any form? So another area of horror that this movie excels at is with the concept of the escape to nowhere. In a lot of horror scenarios, the characters are oftentimes stranded in an environment where escape is rendered unlikely or impossible due to whatever circumstances. However, there's another area where even if the ability to leave was available, there are certain instances where should they get out, the idea of escape is just as risky, if not more so than the present situation, or even sometimes pointless. Two notable movies that did this well are the 1978 Dawn of the Dead and The Mist, although The Mist took this leagues further with what it did afterwards as far as twists go. In Dawn of the Dead, for example, the characters are trapped in a shopping mall, and through the events that transpire, they make the choice to leave in a helicopter with no known destination, or even sufficient knowledge of the current state of things outside. This creates a whole new level of horror because we're already in a hopeless situation that is only exemplified by this. Beyond the Black Rainbow does something very similar in that we don't know the state of the outside world, as we're only shown things in a very contained and secluded environment. Most of the movie takes place deep within the Arborea Institute, and the only knowledge we have of anything outside comes from Barry, whom we already know we cannot trust. He says they are living in troubled and dangerous times, and that Elena is safer where she is. We can take this two ways, really. As the film is indeed set in 1983, so the Cold War was in full swing, as evidenced by Reagan on the TV set, and a radio in the movie even references the invasion of Grenada that went down that year. But at the same time, we're clearly witnessing a level of technology akin to science fiction. Therefore, we can safely assume that this timeline might be different. If this is the case, the outside world might actually be more dangerous. As the Institute itself implies a dystopian vibe, the outside world may be even more oppressive or frightening, if it even still exists. These types of questions being raised by a simple setting and a few phrases muttered by a character is fucking awesome.
These are times of great uncertainty.
This was brilliantly conveyed by Elena's TV viewing segment in her room. As we mentioned earlier, she flips through some channels, but while doing so, she comes across a martial arts match, a police chase, and finally a cartoon. All of these would be innocent enough, but upon closer inspection, we can conclude that violence is out there, and not just violence, people who practice it and are applauded for it. Crimes are being committed and are considered entertainment for people to watch, and the cartoon literally describes her situation as we're shown a funny little character fighting off monsters, only to be captured by a big bad wolf-like figure and devoured. And finally, when it comes to the surface level of horror, what better way to shock and strike fear into your audience than to put on a leather suit and stab a bunch of people to death? It comes out of nowhere for most people watching this movie, and I feel like while it does have its drawbacks, the payoff is well worth it. This movie goes from a surreal, almost psychological thriller to a straight-up slasher flick in what seems like the blink of an eye. But hear me out. When I say the blink of an eye, I mean the literal transition is relatively quick in terms of the film's pacing, but symbolically and narratively, it's excellently done. See, the whole time Barry is a creepy fuck, yeah, we know, but as the film goes on, the guy gets creepier, and you can see how he is simply losing the calm and collected demeanor he has in the beginning, and he begins succumbing to the darker impulses, which are his true nature. More on that later. So he takes off any semblance of his outward appearance that we knew, not just figuratively, but literally with the contact lenses and the Carl Sagan hair, and he dresses up in his custom black leather attire, the legs of which look not only expensive, but comfy as hell, too, as evidenced by his near-orgasmic reaction to sliding his arm slowly through the sleeve before softly but quickly emerging through the opening and erupting his digits outward. Anyway, he then gets himself his trusty knife in its own protective case, which is literally a whole other level of psycho. See, when people get guns, they sometimes get a nice custom case to keep it safe and locked up, but this guy has a knife, which implies it is not only very important, but also very expensive. It gives a reverent-like aura, which is accentuated by the dramatic shining lights off its blade, so it's as if we're being introduced to an entirely new character at that point. He then proceeds to kill everyone, and as I mentioned before, we get lots of death, which was an interesting decision to make because it's almost a reward for those who are fans of horror for putting up with a slower plot. You get the already creepy vibes the movie has going for it, but then it just turns it up to 11 towards the end as a way of saying, thanks for hanging around. Barry even has such a well-delivered interaction with the image of himself that we, the audience, knew, literally to reassure us that this guy is fucking gone. This is who he is now.
You're doing so good.
Before we do anything else, though, I want to point out my favorite damn scene in this movie, the phone scene in general. I mentioned it earlier for being great with the weird stinger it has, but what I didn't get to bring up is how overall the scene is damn scary. First, we have the weird call, okay, sure, but notice the whole thing goes out of focus with the jarring camera angle having Barry almost entirely off screen. Then he clearly gets upset and hangs up, his voice slightly breaking as if he's on the verge of tears. Then we get that fucking stinger that is so damn creepy, and it's all topped off with the phone being unplugged. This raises too many questions. One, who was on the other end of that line? Who, pray tell, could possibly have made this guy, our creepy authoritarian main antagonist, as unsettled as he was? What was the voice even saying? What was that stinger we heard? What is happening at all? These questions make for some great spookiness. Alright, now let's get out there and really go beyond to talk about some of the lesser known but still creepy and powerful themes and motifs that this film gets right. Heads up, it's gonna get even weirder from here on out. One of the main ideas of the film, as expressed through several images, is be yourself. On the outside, that's a pretty simple statement, but in this regard, it's meant as a spiritual journey to discover your inner workings and personality and transform oneself to be happy and content. A very Buddhist-like mindset. This is a pretty common idea of spirituality, and the movie does a great job at using Barry to represent the perversion of this idea. Barry is indeed coming to terms with his own transformation, and through his own therapy sessions, ironically, due to them being aimed at Elena, he's learning to be himself. However, what he becomes is an even greater monster. A little bit of misdirection goes a long way.
Yeah, he's a psychopathic killer, but so what? There's plenty of them around.
Another important area the film delves into is the concept of yin and yang, or simply put, just the duality of light and dark. Where there is one, so too shall there be the other. This is represented primarily by Barry and Elena and the relationship that they share. Barry being dark and Elena obviously being the light, though neither is necessarily more in control than the other. Barry is prying to get into Elena and, but Elena, though being contained, has immense power. Each is linked by their shared psychic abilities and treatments and are inexplicably bound, despite being distinctly separated. Not only are they depicted as black and white within their motivations and intentions, good and evil, but also literally in their clothing, with Barry being dressed in black and Elena having the white gown she wears. Red and white are also colors representative of the motivations and character traits of these two, as is shown by their distinct lighting in their respective scenes. Red is oftentimes associated with power, lust, aggressiveness, whereas white is usually considered pure, reverent, clean, peaceful. When put together, the two are a powerful combination in ancient myths, meaning blood and bone, which can symbolize both life and death. So there you go, a good effective use of horror in that it is the struggle to confront your own personal demons, which are always there in the darkness. And then we get into sexuality and suppression. I've alluded to this a lot, but if I must go into detail, well, let me go into detail. We're constantly shown Barry obsessing over Elena and creepily watching her for almost the entire duration of the film, and as he's doing this, he gets more and more intense with not just his stare, but his body language. As if this wasn't enough, we're shown the designs in the notebook discovered by Margot, and if creepy overt lusting wasn't enough for you, well, maybe the dick suit can help drive the point home. Not to mention, during the flashback sequence, I'm pretty sure we blatantly see Barry fully nude. These sexual themes aren't just limited to the obvious. There's all sorts of innuendos with double meanings to several needle injections with questionable deliverance and reactions. Barry's orgasmic reactions to killing Rosemary and Arborea, all the way to putting on leathers like I described earlier. The leathers alone are a commentary on the nature of this guy's sadism and a little bit of misguided representation of BDSM. I know, it always gets a bad rap, I'm with you. But this guy drags the knife across his crotch before sniffing Elena's bedsheets deeply, and he specifically thrusts his metallic blade into the moist, wide-open mouths of two guys that explode in a powerful spray of bodily fluids. Blood. Anyway, super disturbing sexual desires that lead to bloodshed? Yep, a pretty good element of horror. Speaking of blood, that brings me to an idea the film gets into symbolically, which is the idea of a redshift. Hear me out. A redshift occurs when you theoretically enter a black hole. Once you go over the event horizon, gravity does weird shit to light where you would, to an outside observer, just remain stationary there as if frozen, and turn redder and redder until disappearing. This is a film dominated by its use of colors and their associated symbolism, even to the point of its slight detriment. So it makes sense, at least to me, that certain instances the film portrays have very specific meanings when it comes to the dominant color. There is a clear divide between Elena and Barry in the beginning. Mainly, Barry exists in red-lit rooms and Elena in blue and white. I mentioned this earlier, but now we're going to go into the details. This divide is never broken until the Sentionaut sequence, when Elena's normally blue/white and presence is now dominated by the red lights of Barry's presence. I call this the film's redshift. We've figuratively crossed the event horizon, aka the point of no return, and are now on a spiral towards destruction so far as we can tell. The reason I'm choosing a black hole reference is because this film uses them symbolically as well, albeit a bit tangentially. Also, the image of a black hole can be symbolic of the figurative rabbit hole, used to measure crazy and surreal situations from, again, there is no return, or returning is difficult. What I meant by tangentially related is that we're referring to the abyss in a psychological and spiritual way. Though there are tons of images of black holes, literally, such as the dilating pupil in the opening credits and the black goo Barry submerges himself in, not to mention his own busted eyes towards the end. The abyss, in a figurative sense, is the seemingly dark and bottomless pit. It represents the uncertain depths that exist within us all, the subconscious and darkness which cannot be measured, so we remain as far above as we can, but should we stray too close, we may be consumed. And of course, who could forget our friend Nietzsche, who said, when you gaze into the abyss gazes back. We as the audience experience this concept by watching Barry's descent into madness both literally with the flashback scene and figuratively with the progression of the story. He descends into a world of color and wonder only to be overtaken by a blackness which he brings back in the form of his shadow self, which only feeds off the primal urges and impulses. He became a monster. Upon his awkward, primordial rebirth scene, he recounts later having seen the eye of God, which chose him.
So beautiful. Like a black rainbow.
A man descending into darkness only to return psychopathic and murderous, or trying to articulate that which is incomprehensible, such as a black rainbow? Sounds like some good horror elements to me.
The dark inside me from the other place. I won't go back there. I won't.
What's more interesting is to think, did he bring something back with him? Some kind of evil? Or was he always this disturbed on the inside? These are questions that never get answered, but are wonderful. I think one of the grandest motifs this film presents is the concept of spirituality through the aid of psychedelics, a major controversy amongst many in the New Age camp. Through my experience, this has been loosely designated as chemonosis, the attaining of higher-level knowledge through the use of mind-altering substances. While many think that this is a cheating way to go about spirituality, the truth cannot be denied that they are most often lumped in together, much to the dismay of the more sober followers of the New Age path. So what does this have to do with anything? Well, let's look at what the film explores. The dangers of drug-induced altered states of mind. Barry is given a dose of a powerful psychedelic drug and is utterly broken by it. This is not actually too far off from a real-world possibility, as psychedelic drugs have been linked to minor instances of permanently altering one's personality, despite their willingness, to completely unearthing and activating a latent mental instability previously undetected. Hell, psychedelics can even introduce temporary psychosis, which can even cost the user their life. Point is, Barry goes on this trip and comes back utterly destroyed, which ties in with what we mentioned earlier about gazing into the abyss. So what am I getting at here? There's a real-world fear associated with taking psychedelic drugs, which keeps many people from ever actually trying them. And I think this movie has a clever way of introducing this fear to the mainstream. This brings us to the other side of this coin, the dangers of spiritualism on its own. I know, sounds ridiculous, right? But believe it or not, this also ties directly into our referencing the abyss. See, self-introspection can be daunting, not just because most people don't really know where to start, but usually they're subconsciously afraid of what they'll uncover. They're afraid to know what lies beneath and what they themselves might be capable of. Not to mention, both concepts, spiritualism and psychedelic-related ventures, can each lead to an interesting and life-altering experience called ego death, the complete disintegration of one's sense of self. Powerful and damn frightening if not experienced in a controlled or somewhat controlled setting, which can forever alter your personality. I also want to note that this film has a ton of commentary on the nature of spirituality in general, everything from its effectiveness, oddness, and downright futility. Notice in this scene, we see an anthropological skull of some sort, a nod to the stoned ape theory that is at some point primitives discovered hallucinogenics and our great leaps in consciousness came from this. In the same scene, we see Barry admiring some quartz crystals, a commentary on stone and crystal healing, noting its oddness, and finally we're shown Dr. Arborea, someone who seemingly attained enlightenment to the point where he could help others achieve such a thing, only to be strung out and drugged up, reminiscing of better times. And finally, this movie does an interesting job at describing how society treats spiritual endeavors. It thinks you're crazy. This is evidenced by Barry being forced to wear his appliances to look normal and take copious amounts of prescription drugs to remain normal and docile after his mind-shattering experience. Even with Elena, we see this to a degree. Girl has psychic powers, better drug her up and keep her restrained. Speaking of which, let's quickly overanalyze the trip sequence. The whole sequence is bright and washed out white. This is reminiscent of early visions of birth, as babies can't really see but can recognize faces. Barry descends into the black liquid, like we discussed, reminiscent of the rabbit hole / black hole, point of no return. Third eye painted onto his head to represent he is undergoing an awakening and altering his perception, like we discussed. Third eye is also forming a triangle, a shape important to the movie with the pyramid. He experiences the death of the ego. His physical form is dissolved into the world of colors around him, but as shown by the expressions of his face, abject horror. The process is overwhelming him, and his colors turn black. The darkness then permeates the entire experience, and he is changed. He crawls from the blackness, completely covered in the substance, representing his rebirth, and due to the death of his ego, he is only operating on the desires of the id, like the mind of early childhood, and he kills Arboria's wife. Afterwards, Elena is born and dipped into the same black substance. So if you're wondering what any of that was about, that's pretty much it as far as I could tell. But hey, I'd love to hear what anyone else thinks. Okay, so this is like 5 times longer than I was expecting it to be, so let's start to wrap things up with the cons. And this movie has plenty of them. Like, for example, what the fuck is this movie even about? No joke, as much as I was able to derive from the plot, many have been left pretty confused about more than just what the movie is trying to say. They're confused about what it's even about. Now, this is a natural drawback to experimental and artsy films in that they don't always translate as well to a wider audience, but man, this is a weird movie, and I don't want to say that everything I've ascribed to it doing well was actually intentional. Yeah, that sounds pretty harsh, but in all honesty, this movie really does feel like it's all just surface level, and any meaning you got out of it is purely your own, which is why I hope to get some discussion going with this movie, because I want to know how off base I might be with my analysis. A couple of other scenes I had issue with were with the mutant patient, for one. Like, why? What does this have to do with anything, and why so late in the game? I guess at this point the whole thing is spiraling out of control narrative-wise, but it seems so disjointed. Which brings us right to the whole slasher film plotline. Like, what? When did this movie suddenly switch gears? I know I mentioned this as being done well in the video, but realistically I can see how many took this as the movie trying to be too many things at once. Because it honestly does feel that way. It wants to have the ambiguity of 2001: A Space Odyssey while still paying homage to the 80s horror icons, but like, what? Look, there's a difference between having a detailed plot that is hidden within the work, but it's a whole other thing to leave pertinent details out on purpose to give the illusion of depth. Then there are vague character relations, like I mentioned earlier with Rosemary. Is she Barry's wife, mom, or sister? We don't know, and the movie doesn't tell us. The woman who Barry killed, was that Dr. Arboria's wife? And did Barry rape her? Or just kill her? We don't know. Was she pregnant when she died? We don't know. These are crucial details that are seemingly just thrown off to the side as if we wouldn't notice, because, you know, you don't need to understand how characters are connected to one another. Look at them die! It's a horror movie! Also, Barry's death is instantaneous and super anticlimactic. Like, they were really pressed for time and decided, yeah, just fuck it, just go with it. I mean, I get it kind of makes sense narratively. He's a tortured, broken man and his death is like a mercy killing, but I mean, that's it? Just a quick fall over and crack, and then Elena just laughs. Speaking of which, her character is literally a blank slate. Yeah, I mean, wonderful emotional performance, but like, we literally only hear her voice once, and she just kind of doesn't say anything at all afterwards. She cries a lot, and that's supposed to gain sympathy from us, but you need more than that in a character. If you don't know what depression is like, then you just kind of can't relate to her. And that's coming from someone who knows depression. Then, when she kills the nurse, she doesn't seem remorseful at all. And yeah, I get it's because the nurse was abusive and all, but Jesus, you just kill her over the photograph? Then she kills Barry and laughs, like, haha, you're dead. And I honestly just kind of felt bad for Barry more in that moment than for her. It all just seems so scattered and incongruent. And don't even get me started on the escape sequence. Like, oh my god, look at the cover art. Okay, look at the cover art. Okay. Or the poster for the film, whatever. Yeah, look, see how she's running like that? Yeah? Well, that doesn't fucking happen. There is so much goddamn time dedicated to Elena just slowly dragging her feet out of the place at the end. And yeah, I get it. It's meant to add tension, like shit could go south any second, but come on! She moves so slowly and the ending just drags and drags. Then we get the two chodes at the campfire, which is like, first of all, why are these guys friends?
Thanks for telling me.
Get bent, fat fuck!
Secondly, what are they doing out there? Finally, why does Barry suggest they touched or had anything to do with Elena when all he had to do was check his tracker and he would see she's not anywhere near them? I mean, Whatever, we got 2 brutal deaths out of it. Finally, I've watched this movie like 10 fucking times now, and then I read that there's an after credits sequence. I hate after credits sequences. It's like, yeah, I know, people worked really hard on this movie and they should be recognized, but I hate sitting there and being deceived with some stupid semi-pointless scene. This one has an after credits scene that is kind of okay, I mean, I like it, but it's still really dumb that it's included because it just feels like yet another attempted layer of depth. I personally feel like it may be important, but somehow I fucking doubt it. So let me end this one by saying I really love this movie, and it's a perfect example of some retro-style horror done in a unique fashion while trying to tell an original story. For all its weaknesses, its strengths are way more impactful, and I think you'll honestly enjoy this if you check it out. Hey, even if you don't, maybe we can discuss some areas where you feel differently. So let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you guys next time. Thanks for watching.